Tonight on the Midnight Drive, hotels are curious places. Thousands of people pass through the same front door. They sleep in the same rooms. They look out the same windows. They walk the same hallways. Then by morning, they're gone. Most buildings spend their lives watching the same families come and go. Hotels almost never have that luxury. Tonight, we're checking into some of Alaska's most famous haunted hotels, where stories of lingering guests and restless spirits have become part of the local folklore. But I've started wondering if buildings like this are haunted for a much simpler reason. Maybe nowhere collects more human stories than a place nobody was ever meant to stay. I've always thought hotels occupy a strange place in our lives. They're built for people who are not staying. That sounds contradictory, but it's true. Nobody moves into room 214 and just starts planting flowers outside the window. Nobody paints the walls. Nobody hangs family photographs in the hallway. Hotels are designed around impermanence. They exist for people passing through. That's what makes them different from almost every other building that we spend time in. Homes collect lives. Hotels collect moments. I've been thinking about that all week because Alaska has no shortage of haunted hotels. Spend enough time reading local folklore and you'll find stories about mysterious footsteps, apparitions wandering old hallways, phantom perfume that's drifting through empty rooms, televisions turning themselves on, and guests checking out with stories they swear that they will never, ever forget. I've noticed something, though. The ghost stories almost always come second. The building is what always comes first. And there's a reason for that. Old hotels aren't simply old buildings. They're crossroads. Imagine the number of people who have walked through the front doors of a hotel that's been standing for over 100 years. Prospectors heading toward the Klondike. Businessmen chasing opportunities. Families beginning vacations. Couples celebrating anniversaries. Soldiers heading home. Workers passing through for a single night. People arriving after receiving the best news of their lives. People arriving after receiving the worst news of their lives. The building quietly witnesses all of it. And then morning comes. Someone checks out. Someone else checks in. And life goes on. The hotel remains. Isn't that fascinating? Because unlike a family home, which becomes deeply connected to a relatively small number of people, hotels become connected to thousands, maybe even millions. Every single room in the building has held joy. Every single room in the building has held disappointment. Somewhere in that building, someone probably celebrated a marriage. And somewhere else, another person quietly cried after a phone call that changed everything. One room hosted a reunion. Another hosted a goodbye. The walls don't get to choose which stories they keep. They simply collect them. And isn't that a remarkable thing to think about? Our own lives aren't built entirely from monumental moments. Most of us are collections of brief encounters. Conversations we barely remember. Teachers whose names we've forgotten but whose encouragement still echoes decades later. A stranger who smiled on a difficult afternoon. An old friend we haven't spoke to in years. Life accumulates. One ordinary moment after another. Hotels seem to understand that. I've wondered if that's why people so easily attach stories to them. Not because they're old, but because they're layered. Every guest leaves behind something invisible. Not a ghost, an impression. The knowledge that another human being briefly occupied exactly the same space that you are standing in right now. Maybe that's why hotel hallways feel different late at night. It's not necessarily scary, it's just very reflective. You start thinking about everyone who has walked that same carpet before you. How many conversations happened behind those closed doors? How many people were beginning new chapters? How many people thought they were ending one? Then there's the Golden North Hotel in Skagway, home to one of Alaska's best-known stories, Scary Mary. I've never liked that nickname. It almost feels like it distracts from the actual story. Because if the legend is true, there's nothing particularly scary about Mary. It's heartbreaking, actually. According to local tradition, Mary came north with her fiancé during the gold rush. Like so many people at the time, they arrived carrying immense amounts of hope. Gold had a remarkable ability to convince people that tomorrow would be better than yesterday. Fortunes waited just beyond the next mountain, or so they believed. Her fiancé left to search for gold. Mary stayed behind, waiting. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. He never returned. Some versions say he died. Others say he simply disappeared into the wilderness. Nobody really knows. What survived was not certainty. It was the waiting. That's the part that stays with me. Not the ghost, the waiting. I've realized waiting has a strange relationship with places. Have you noticed this? If someone you love always arrives through the same front door, that doorway begins carrying emotional weight. Every sound in the hallway catches your attention. Every set of footsteps makes your heart race just a little bit. Maybe this time. Hope can be incredibly persistent. Sometimes even more persistent than reality. I've wondered if that's why Mary's story continues being told. Not because people believe they've seen a ghost, because almost everyone seems to understand waiting. Waiting for someone to come home. Waiting for difficult news. Waiting for life to become what we imagined that it would be. The details change, the emotion doesn't. That's why stories survive, not because they're always factual, but because they're recognizable. And somewhere inside of Mary's story, if you think about it really hard, you dig deep, deep down, I think that we can recognize ourselves. More coming up next, right here on the Midnight Drive. I've started becoming pretty suspicious of places that try a little too hard to convince me that they're haunted. Not because I think they're lying necessarily, because certainty has always made me uncomfortable. If a place immediately tells me exactly what happened, exactly where it happened, exactly who still wanders the hallways, I find myself slowing down. Not because I'm dismissing the story, because I'm wondering who actually benefits from it. And I get it, that probably sounds pretty cynical. I don't mean it that way. History and tourism have always shared an interesting relationship. Communities tell stories because stories help places survive. And sometimes those stories preserve history. And sometimes they become folklore. Sometimes they slowly become marketing. And every now and then, it's difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. I found myself thinking about that while reading about Alaska's Historic Anchorage Hotel. It's probably the state's most famous haunted hotel. Guests report footsteps, faucets turn on by themselves, televisions flickering to life in the middle of the night, a lady in white, a former mayor, a tragic death in room 215. Even a ghost log sits at the front desk, inviting guests to write down anything unusual they experienced during their stay. I'll admit, my first reaction was not fear. It was curiosity. Not about the ghosts, about the guest log, or ghost log, if you will. Imagine checking into a hotel. You're handed a room key, and then someone smiles and says, "If anything paranormal happens tonight, don't forget to write it down right here." Now, whether they intend to or not, they have planted a seed into your psyche. Because now every creaking floorboard becomes interesting. Every pipe inside the walls suddenly deserves your attention. Every shadow asks another question. Something that we talk about a lot on this show is expectation, because expectation is a remarkably powerful thing. Our brains don't simply observe reality. Our brains interpret it. If I ask you to count every red car during your drive home tonight, you'll probably notice more red cars than you have ever noticed before. And it's not because more appeared necessarily. It's because your attention changed. And maybe haunted hotels work the exact same way. That doesn't make people's experiences fake, per se. It just makes their responses human. There's another story from Alaska that stayed with me all week. Lydia. The woman said to remain inside the Red Onion Saloon long after everyone else has gone home. The version that you'll usually hear is very simple. Lydia loved the place so much that she never left. Maybe. But if I'm honest, which I try to be honest with you guys on this show, I do, that explanation has never sat comfortably with me. History has a weird habit of smoothing rough edges. Complicated people slowly become simple characters. Messy lives become tidy legends. And whenever I hear a story suggesting someone working under incredibly difficult circumstances was perfectly happy exactly where they were, I instinctively become very cautious. Not because I know the truth, because I don't. I just think people usually deserve more complexity than folklore sometimes allow. Maybe Lydia loved the friendships that she built there. Maybe she dreamed of leaving. Maybe she laughed every day. Maybe she cried every night. Maybe all of those things were true. People rarely fit into a single sentence. That's why I've become much more interested in the humanity of these stories rather than the paranormal claims. Scary Mary wasn't memorable because she became a ghost. She was memorable because she waited. Lydia isn't memorable because people claim to smell perfume in an empty room. She's memorable because she reminds us there was once a real person behind the legend. A woman with hopes and with dreams, fears, and compromises. The ghost story arrived later. I've noticed that happens a lot. Have you? Time slowly sands away complexity until only the broad outlines remain. It's easier to remember, easier to retell, easier to print on postcards. But maybe the truth is more beautiful than the legend. Because the truth usually includes ordinary people trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances. That's a story I understand. I've stayed in enough old hotels to know that they have personalities. Not ghosts, personalities. Wood settles differently after 100 winters. Old radiators hiss, pipes groan, floorboards complain beneath your weary feet. The building breathes in ways modern buildings rarely do. Late at night, lying awake in an unfamiliar room, every sound becomes just a little more noticeable. Not because the building changed, it's because you did. You became still enough to hear it. And maybe that's another reason hotels attract ghost stories. It's one of the few places where we're forced to pause. The television eventually turns off. The meetings are over. Vacation plans are finished for the day. You're left with the thoughts of the day in a room that has held thousands of other people before you. That's an unusually reflective place to be. Reflection has a funny way of making history feel closer. I've realized something while driving through Alaska this week. I don't think haunted hotels are really haunted by spirits. I think they're haunted by accumulation. Thousands of arrivals, reunions, goodbyes, ordinary moments quietly layered one on top of another until the building begins feeling larger than the bricks it was built on. Maybe that's why places like this continue telling stories long after the people have gone home.